For 10 long years, I pretended I couldn't read, all so that my husband would never suspect what I knew. Every Thursday night, he locked himself in his study with a red leather diary, believing his secrets were safe, because his wife was too simple to understand cursive. He never imagined those very pages would one day be read aloud by me. If stories like this speak to you, I'd be honored if you subscribed or left a thought in the comments. It helps me keep sharing these voices of truth and resilience. So tell me, how would you feel if the person you trusted most wrote you off as a fool? Wishing you peace and a gentle evening wherever you're listening from. The summer air in Vermont had a way of clinging to the skin, heavy and fragrant with pine sap and the faint sweetness of apple orchards in bloom. Even now, as I sit in my small New England home with the window open to the Atlantic breeze, I can close my eyes and smell it. The scent of a world both wide and narrow, a childhood bound to the soil and the rigid traditions of the time. Our town was little more than a cluster of weathered houses, a white church steeple, and the general store, all wrapped by rolling hills and long dirt roads that seemed to stretch farther than any of us girls were ever expected to go. It was the 1940s, and the rules for daughters were as strict as the frost that bit our winters. Cook, sew, marry, and keep quiet. For decades, I carried a truth pressed against my heart like a hidden scar, a truth I reveal to you now, after a lifetime of silence. I pretended not to know how to read for 10 long years. 10 years of feigning confusion over letters, of letting others believe I was too simple to decipher words. And why? Because the man I married trusted my supposed ignorance more than he ever trusted my love. I said nothing, waiting, biding my time, until the night came when I unlocked his red leather diary and read aloud the secrets he thought I could never understand. But before I take you to that night, you must know how the deception was born. My father was a stern man, his hands roughened by farm work, his voice filled with certainty that a girl's future was written in flour and fabric, not in books. A daughter who spends too much time with letters will scare off a good husband, he used to say, shaking his head as though education itself was poison. My mother, who had inherited the same beliefs from her own mother, nodded silently and pressed her lips together, sealing away whatever dreams she might have once had. My brothers went to school each morning, their satchels swinging from their shoulders, while I was left to gather eggs, mend hems, and tend to the stove. I remember standing at the gate, watching them vanish down the dirt road, feeling as though the world itself had locked me out. Yet destiny, or perhaps mercy, sent me a chance. Across the field lived the Carter family, owners of a prosperous farm. Their daughter, Lydia, was about my age, and unlike me, she had lessons. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a woman from the city arrived in a faded blue wagon, carrying a leather satchel filled with books. Her name was Mrs. Davenport. She was a woman of nearly 60, with silver hair drawn into a neat bun, spectacles that magnified her wise eyes, and dresses always pressed to perfection. I used to sneak glances at her from behind the chicken coop as she sat under the elm tree, teaching Lydia to trace words with her finger. The way those words danced on Lydia's lips, the way she smiled as though she were being handed keys to invisible doors. My heart ached with longing. One afternoon, while my mother was busy with the laundry, I dared to cross the fence. My palms were damp as I clutched a basket of eggs, the shells warm from the hens. Mrs. Davenport was packing up her books, slipping them into her satchel with care. My voice quivered as I asked, "Mum, do you teach anyone? Even someone like me?" She looked over her spectacles, her expression softening as though she had been expecting me all along. Child, anyone who wants to learn deserves a teacher, she said, her tone both stern and kind. I offered her the eggs, trembling, and she accepted with a smile that warmed me more than the July sun. So it began, my secret education. 3 times a week, while Lydia learned sums and history indoors, I met Mrs. Davenport behind the old barn. She brought scraps of paper and tattered books, and I brought whatever vegetables or eggs I could slip from our kitchen without raising suspicion. We would crouch under the shade of the maple tree, her voice patient as she guided my finger across the lines. A, B, C, cat, dog, sun. Each letter became a spark, each word a flame, and I felt as though I had been starving for years and finally tasted bread. At night, when everyone slept, I scratched letters into the dirt with a stick, erasing them quickly with my foot when footsteps approached. Sometimes I stole old newspapers from the trash, hiding them under my pillow, reading by the light of a stub of candle I had smuggled from the kitchen drawer. 8 years of stolen lessons passed. By the time I turned 19, I could read with fluency equal to any high school graduate, though no one outside of Mrs. Davenport and Lydia suspected it. It was my rebellion, my jewel, hidden deep where no one could tarnish it. And then, in the summer of 1962, he arrived. Charles Whitmore. He was 34 then, a widower with hair black as ink and just a trace of silver near his temples. He owned the finest fabric store in town, his suits pressed to perfection, his shoes always shining. The day I first saw him was at the Saturday market. I was helping my mother sell tomatoes when he stopped at our stand. His eyes lingered on me longer than politeness required, and then he said, with a voice smooth as polished wood, "You have the ripest tomatoes in this whole market." My face flushed crimson, though whether from his words or the July heat, I could not say. He returned week after week, always buying just enough to start a conversation, never too much to seem eager. My mother noticed, of course. She began to send me to the market alone, her expression firm but hopeful. "A man like that is a blessing, Eleanor," she whispered one evening, her eyes gleaming with the dreams she carried for me. After 3 months of courtship, Charles asked for my hand, and my father, pleased to secure a son-in-law with wealth and reputation, agreed without hesitation. At first, I was entranced. Charles spoke of Boston, of business trips, of fabrics imported from faraway places. He treated me with courtesy, showered me with gifts, and in June of 1963 we married in the white-steepled church at the town's centre. The celebration was the grandest our community had seen. Fresh apple pies on long tables, fiddles playing in the warm evening air, neighbours congratulating my parents on their daughter's good fortune. As I stood beside Charles in my lace gown, I thought perhaps my life had finally opened into a new chapter of promise. But promise, as I would learn, can be a fragile thing. Married life with Charles quickly revealed habits as sharp-edged as his pressed collars. He insisted on order, on meals served precisely at 6, on shirts ironed in a particular way. He was not cruel, not in the obvious sense, but he was meticulous to the point of suffocation. And there was one ritual that set my nerves on edge. Every Thursday evening, after supper, he would retire to his study. He would lock the door behind him, and for an hour or more the sound of a pen scratching paper filled the silence of our house. At first, I thought it harmless. "Accounting," he explained when I asked, his smile easy, but his eyes evasive. Yet one night, months into our marriage, I carried a tray of tea to his study, knocking gently before entering. He startled like a boy caught misbehaving, snapping shut a red leather-bound book and slipping it into the drawer of his desk. He locked it with a small brass key before turning to me with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just a personal journal, my dear," he said lightly. "Every man needs a place to order his thoughts." But why did his shoulders stiffen each time he wrote? Why did his mood swing so wildly after those Thursday sessions, at times distant, at times strangely calm? And why, above all, did he insist on writing only in that looping, serpentine cursive, as if daring the world to try and follow? It was in that moment, as I watched the gleam of the key vanish into his pocket, that I understood. Charles had secrets he never intended me to see. He believed his diary was safe, hidden by ink and curves I was too ignorant to decipher. What he did not know, what he could not imagine, was that the very ignorance he prized in me was the mask I had chosen to wear. And so, every Thursday, as the door to his study clicked shut and the scratching of his pen began, I sat in silence and waited. Waited, with a heart both steady and restless, for the day the mask would fall away. Suspicion crept into my days like a shadow that never left, yet I hid it with careful skill, folding it away behind lowered eyes and hesitant gestures. Around Charles, I stumbled over words that I had mastered years before, deliberately confusing letters, holding a page too close to my face, mouthing sounds as though trying to decipher their mystery. Each slip, each exaggerated mistake, gave him comfort. He seemed to relax in the belief that his wife was still half literate, a harmless woman clinging to scraps of knowledge. In his gaze, I was no more than an obedient, childlike partner, and in that role, I found my safest disguise. Charles carried himself with a confidence that only grew as my supposed failures continued. At gatherings in the parlours of our neighbours, where lamps glowed warm against velvet curtains and polished wood floors reflected the flicker of firelight, he often told stories at my expense. "My Eleanor," he would say with a smirk, "is learning to read slowly, like a little girl with her primer. She gets one or two words right, then loses her way." His companions would chuckle politely, glasses of bourbon in hand, while their wives glanced at me with pity disguised as sympathy. I smiled softly, lowering my eyes to my lap, cheeks flushed in an act of embarrassment. Inwardly, though, I absorbed every barb, every condescending remark, and stored it deep within me as fuel for my secret rebellion. The house became a stage where two versions of me performed. By day, I was the fumbling wife, praising my husband's patience and laughing at my own slowness. By night, I stepped into another life entirely, one that belonged only to me. My friend Ophelia Carter had given me that life. She was a woman of quiet dignity, in her 30s, with chestnut hair always neatly drawn back, her skirts pressed with care, her manner direct but gentle. Working at the local bank, she carried herself with a certainty that made some in town whisper she was too independent. To me, she was nothing less than a lifeline. Ophelia began slipping me books, the kind of books no one expected a woman in a small Vermont town to read. Slim volumes on women's rights, pocket-sized guides to legal basics, manuals on financial management. She delivered them discreetly, tucked inside parcels of fabric or wrapped in plain brown paper, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing light. "These will keep you company," she would murmur, and I understood the weight of what she offered. At night, by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, I turned the pages with reverence, tracing sentences that spoke of freedom, of ownership, of dignity that had too long been denied. The world within those pages filled the silence of my room. I learned how a woman might defend herself in matters of property, how signatures held power, how laws could be twisted against those who did not know them. I scribbled notes in margins, underlined words with a steady hand, and each night felt myself grow stronger, wiser, less bound to the role Charles believed I played. Knowledge seeped into me like rain into dry soil, unseen by those who dismissed me, but nourishing something deep and unyielding. Meanwhile, Charles's own pride betrayed him. His laughter at my mistakes grew sharper, his tone more dismissive. He patted my shoulder in public as one might praise a child, and he spoke of me to others as though I were a pet project, a wife being taught to read by her benevolent husband. At dinner parties, he leaned back, sipping whiskey, saying with pride, "She's coming along, though it's slow. Cursive still defeats her." The room would laugh, and I would smile faintly, but inside, my resolve grew solid as stone. The more invisible he thought me, the more powerful I became in my invisibility. I remember one particular winter's evening when the snow outside piled high against the porch steps and the wind rattled the shutters with icy fingers. Charles had spent the day in his study, shuffling papers with more agitation than usual. His temper was short, his footsteps heavy across the wood floors, and when he finally left for a meeting, his absence felt like a sudden clearing of storm clouds. I entered his study to straighten the desk, the smell of ink and old paper hanging in the air, the fire still smouldering faintly in the hearth. That was when I saw it. The brass key, small and ordinary, lying forgotten inside the open drawer where he had left it in his haste. My breath caught, and I stood frozen, the house pressing in around me in a silence so heavy it felt alive. The steady tick of the mantel clock seemed suddenly deafening, each second a drumbeat in my chest. My hand hovered above the key, trembling, before I closed the drawer softly as if to erase what I had seen. But I could not erase the knowledge. Charles had left behind the very key that unlocked his most guarded secret. The hours that followed were long and heavy. Charles returned home, distracted, muttering about business, and collapsed into bed without a glance toward the study. I lay beside him, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the rhythm of his breathing while my mind circled endlessly around that key. My heart beat so loudly I feared it might wake him, yet he slept on, unaware of the storm raging inside me. When midnight passed and the moonlight streamed through the windows, pale and silver, I rose quietly from bed. The quilt slipped from my shoulders with barely a sound, and my bare feet touched the cold wooden floor as though stepping into another world. The hallway stretched before me, hushed and waiting, the portraits on the walls watching silently as I moved. In the study, the air was cooler, tinged with the scent of ink and smoke. The key lay where I had left it, glinting faintly in the moonlight. My fingers closed around it, the metal cool and steady against my skin, and I felt the weight of a decade pressing into that small object. With careful hands, I slipped it into the lock. The click of the mechanism was soft, almost tender, like a whisper meant only for me. The drawer slid open smoothly, and there it was, the red leather diary. Its cover was worn at the edges, the gold lettering faint but still visible, glowing in the pale light. My hands trembled as I lifted it, the leather warm as though it held the breath of secrets within. For a long moment, I simply held it against me, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The house seemed to lean in around me, every shadow watching. Then, with the same patience that had carried me through years of pretending, I opened the book. The pages lay open before me, their ink curling into loops and strokes I had long since mastered in silence. By the dim spill of moonlight, I began to read, each sentence peeling away the facade of the man sleeping just down the hall. What I found was no gentle reflection, no musings of a merchant jotting his thoughts for comfort. Instead, every line was a blade, cutting into the fragile illusions I had built around my marriage. The diary spoke plainly of deeds that hid behind the velvet curtains of his fabric shop, ugly truths dressed in neat cursive. Charles described the store not as a place of honest business, but as a front, a mask he wore before the town. Behind bolts of imported cloth and rolls of fine linen, there were darker trades. He lent money at crushing interest to families already bent under hardship, bleeding them until their farms were swallowed whole. He arranged for shipments of goods that slipped past customs, silk and wool smuggled through back doors, hidden from the watch of federal officers. Bribes to city officials were detailed with dates, amounts, and names, all written with the precision of an accountant. Each word confirmed that the life I lived in his house was built on foundations of rot. And then, there was her, Marilyn. Even the way he wrote her name carried a tenderness he never spared for me. Marilyn of New York, young and ambitious, with connections in the city. He described their meetings with cold practicality, outlining expenses for hotels, gifts, and dinners. Yet between the numbers lay words of longing that chilled me more than any betrayal of money could. In those lines, my husband was no stern shopkeeper, but a man dreaming of escape. And I, his wife, was only a temporary prop in his carefully drawn play. One passage, written in the summer of 1967, seared itself into me. In 3 years' time, the accounts will be ready. The funds will be moved. By then, Eleanor will serve her last purpose. She is ignorant enough not to question, pliant enough not to resist. Marilyn grows restless, but I've assured her. Soon, she will have all. My hand trembled over the words, though not from tears. For tears never came. The well of sorrow inside me seemed to freeze solid. I sat there in the stillness, listening to the faint creak of the old house, as if it too groaned under the weight of his secrets. I should have wept. Any other woman might have broken under the cruelty of such discovery. But something in me refused. Instead, a clarity, cold and sharp, settled over me. My eyes moved steadily across the page, taking in every digit, every mention of bank transfers, every name of the men he paid off. The ink that once seemed like senseless curls became a map to his hidden world, and I knew I would not close that book without taking some of it with me. I pulled a small notebook from the drawer where I kept scraps of household accounts, lined paper that would not draw suspicion if found. By the pale lamp on the desk, I began to copy. Slowly, deliberately, I transcribed dates, amounts, and connections, my handwriting neat and firm, nothing like the clumsy scrawl I performed for Charles's amusement. Each number I wrote became a stone in the wall I would one day build against him. Each name was a thread in the net I was weaving. As the hours passed, my resolve only deepened. The diary was not just confession. It was evidence, undeniable and damning. The irony was almost unbearable. He had thought my ignorance a shield, protecting him from suspicion, when in truth it had become the very mask behind which I armed myself. He had trusted too much in his own arrogance, in the assumption that the woman at his side was too dull to understand, too blind to see. Turning another page, I found a line that struck me harder than all the rest. Eleanor's ignorance is my finest safeguard. A man could not ask for a better shield. My hand clenched around the leather binding, the words burning into me. Shield? That was what I had been reduced to in his eyes, an object of protection for his corruption, a convenient cloak for his lies. But in that moment, gripping the book until my knuckles whitened, I swore that his shield would become his downfall. The ignorance he cherished in me was nothing but an illusion, one I had cultivated with patience, one I would turn into my greatest weapon. If he believed me blind, then blind I would remain, until the day came when I chose to see and to reveal. I closed the diary softly, placing it back with the same precision he always demanded, aligning it with the edges of the drawer. The key slid into my pocket, hidden away, my heartbeat steady now, no longer frantic. The moonlight caught the edges of my face in the glass of the window, and I did not recognize the woman staring back. She was not weak, nor naive, nor bound by the pity of others. She was armed with truth, and truth is heavier than any blade. I returned to bed before the first pale streak of dawn, Charles sleeping soundly, his breath even, his arm draped loosely across the quilt. I looked at him then, at the man who had called me simple, who had believed my silence was stupidity. I lay beside him, eyes open, pulse calm. And though he would never know it, the war between us had already begun, silent and certain. The announcement of Theodore's arrival came like a chill draught seeping beneath the doors of our house. Charles had received the letter one crisp morning in late autumn, the ink still smelling sharp and official. I saw his face blanch as his eyes scanned the neat lines. It was rare for him to falter, but when he read aloud that his elder brother, Judge Theodore Whitmore of Boston, would be visiting for the weekend, I caught the quick tightening of his jaw and the way his hand lingered on the edge of the table, as though steadying himself against a tremor no one else could see. Theodore Whitmore was a man known far beyond our little Vermont town. He was 10 years older than Charles, a figure of quiet authority, his reputation built on decades of stern rulings and an incorruptible record on the bench. I remembered him from our wedding day, tall, with a lean build, his silver hair cropped neatly above a square, weathered face, and eyes the cold grey of a New England shoreline in November. He had worn a dark suit, nothing ostentatious, but his presence seemed to fill the church, commanding silence without so much as a raised voice. Even then, I had sensed how Charles diminished beside him, shrinking into the role of the younger, less impressive brother. In the days leading up to Theodore's visit, Charles's nerves betrayed him. He straightened curtains twice in a row, barked at the maid for dust motes invisible to anyone else, and repressed shirts that were already stiff with starch. At the dinner table, his fork clinked against his plate too often, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. And I, watching him carefully, realized I had stumbled onto a truth more powerful than any line I'd copied from the red diary. Charles feared his brother. Not just respected him, but truly feared the gaze of the judge who saw men stripped of pretense every day. That fear was the crack in his armor, and I vowed to remember it. But knowledge alone was not enough. I needed proof that could survive the scrutiny of a court, something beyond the private words of a diary he could claim were misinterpreted. For this, I turned to the only person I could trust, Ophelia Carter. She had been my closest friend in town, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, softened by a kind smile, her dark hair always tied back with a ribbon, her dresses simple but neat. She worked at the local bank, a position that earned whispers from neighbours who thought it unseemly for a woman to handle money, but Ophelia wore their disapproval like a badge. One grey afternoon, while arranging flowers in the church vestibule, I told her part of the truth. Not everything. I dared not expose the entire depth of my discovery, but enough that her lips pressed into a thin line. She listened in silence, then leaned closer. "Eleanor," she said softly, "words in a diary can be denied, but numbers, receipts, accounts, those speak for themselves. If you want to protect yourself, you need more than his handwriting. You need evidence no one can dismiss." Her advice took root. Over the weeks that followed, I became a student of secrecy. From Ophelia, I learned how to copy documents without smudging, how to trace letters and numbers carefully so that each page looked as though it had been lifted straight from the original. I learned how to hide my work in plain sight, slipping pages into recipe books and sewing patterns. And slowly, quietly, I began to squirrel away coins and small bills from the household money Charles gave me, placing them into a savings account under a discreet name at Ophelia's bank. Each deposit was small enough to avoid suspicion, but each one gave me a breath of independence I had never known before. Meanwhile, at home, Charles's habits remained unchanged, and that gave me opportunity. Every Thursday night, when he retreated to his office, I prepared his tea and pretended to be too weary to wait up for him. But my eyes followed everything. One evening, as I set down his tray, I noticed his hand careless for once, the key to the desk drawer glinting atop a pile of papers. My heart leapt, though I masked it with a gentle smile. Later, when he was out, I pressed that same key into a bar of soap, careful not to break its fragile outline. With that imprint, I visited a locksmith in town, a discreet old man with rheumy eyes who asked no questions. Days later, I held in my palm a perfect copy of the key that guarded the red diary and the secrets it contained. For the first time, access to his hidden world was no longer dictated by his carelessness, but by my own will. Still, the diary was only the beginning. I gathered small slips of paper, noted dates and shipments, and tucked away the receipts he discarded, always with the lightest of touches so he would not notice. Each piece of evidence was another thread in the net I was weaving, one that would close around him when the time was right. And so it was that when Judge Theodore arrived on a frosty Saturday morning, the air smelling of wood smoke and damp leaves, I felt both dread and a strange flicker of hope. He stepped out of his black car, his long overcoat buttoned, a fedora shadowing his stern eyes. Charles hurried to greet him, his voice an octave too high, his movements stiff with nervous energy. I watched from the porch, keeping my expression serene, but inside, my heart beat fast. Here, in this man who inspired such unease in my husband, lay the possibility of justice. Over supper, Theodore spoke in his calm, measured tones, asking polite questions but never wasting a word. Charles laughed too loudly, explained too quickly, while I answered with modest simplicity. Yet I felt Theodore's gaze linger on me once or twice, as if he saw through layers Charles himself had long overlooked. That night, after they retired to the study for cigars, I lay awake, rehearsing the words I would write. By dawn, I sat at my desk with my own notebook open, pen in hand. My fingers trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of what I was about to do. I wrote to Judge Theodore, explaining in careful sentences what I had uncovered, enclosing copies of the most damning passages and receipts. I wrote not with the flourish of vengeance, but with the steady hand of someone who sought only truth, only justice. When the letter was sealed, I held it to my chest for a long moment, listening to the hush of the sleeping house. Then, at first light, I stepped out into the cold morning air, my shawl wrapped tight, and made my way to the post where I knew it would be delivered directly into the judge's hands. As the envelope slipped from my fingers into the locked box, I whispered a prayer that it would reach him swiftly and safely. I walked back through the quiet streets, the frost crunching beneath my shoes, and for the first time in years I felt not merely like a woman surviving, but like a woman preparing to fight. Theodore returned to Vermont on a grey, brittle morning when the sky seemed to press low over the hills, and the air held that sharp edge of snow not yet fallen. His car rolled to a stop in front of the Whitmore home, the tires leaving shallow tracks in the half-frozen mud of the drive. He stepped out with the gravity of a man accustomed to weighing human failings on a scale of law, his black overcoat falling in a straight line against the wind, a felt hat shadowing his stern, weathered face. Under one arm he carried a leather case swollen with papers, and clutched tightly in his hand was the object that had brought him north, the red diary, its edges worn from the years of secrets it had carried. When Charles hurried to meet him at the porch, his voice broke into a cheerfulness that was too loud, too eager, the sort of tone one might use to mask dread. "Brother?" he exclaimed, forcing a smile that faltered as quickly as it appeared. He ushered Theodore inside, gesturing nervously toward the parlor. I followed quietly, smoothing the apron over my lap, my steps steady, though inside my chest a storm raged. The fire in the hearth snapped with small, irregular cracks, throwing a weak glow that seemed unequal to the chill in the room. Theodore removed his coat with slow precision, hanging it neatly over the stand, his movements deliberate, his silence deliberate. He laid the briefcase on the table, resting the diary atop it as though planting evidence before a jury. His grey eyes swept over both of us, calm but unyielding, and then he spoke, his voice low, resonant, carrying the finality of a gavel strike. "We need to talk." The stillness that followed was suffocating. Even the fire seemed to hush. Charles tugged at his collar, as if it had grown tighter, his mouth working to form words that betrayed his unease. Perhaps we might sit first, Theodore. Eleanor has supper." But Theodore lifted a hand, silencing him without effort. From the case he drew a stack of papers, receipts, records, scraps of evidence painstakingly gathered, and spread them across the table with the patience of a man laying out cards in a high-stakes game. At the center, he placed the diary. The sight of it, there in plain view, made my stomach twist, though not with fear. It was the strange recognition of seeing truth dressed openly in daylight after living so long in shadows. Charles's face shifted from red to pale in a span of seconds, beads of sweat forming at his temples despite the chill. This is outrageous," he sputtered. His voice trembled, though he tried to summon authority. "Lies, misunderstandings. Eleanor barely understands what she sees. She has been confused." He turned toward me then, his eyes darting in desperation, the same eyes that once had charmed me, now sharp with command and plea tangled together. I kept my gaze steady, unmoved, my hands folded in my lap, as if I were still the compliant wife he believed me to be. Inside, though, every nerve hummed with the quiet certainty of what was about to unfold. Theodore's expression did not change. He picked up the diary and extended it toward me. "Then let her read," he said simply. "Here. Now." The moment seemed to stretch into eternity. My hand trembled slightly as I reached out, not from weakness, but from the weight of what this act represented. The leather was warm beneath my fingers, the edges softened by Charles's years of ritual Thursday nights. I opened to the page Theodore had marked, the loops and slants of Charles's cursive unfurling like a map I had travelled many times in secret. My voice came low at first, then steadier, resonant, filling the room with a cadence I had never been permitted to use openly. Eleanor still knows nothing. The fool is my safest shield. The words fell into the air like a stone breaking the surface of water, rippling outward in silence. Charles recoiled as though struck. His lips parted, but no words emerged, his hands twitching at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling like claws searching for purchase. I turned another line, deliberate, letting the venom of his own handwriting spill from my mouth. She asks no questions. She accepts what I tell her. Her ignorance is my protection, her simplicity my advantage. A wife who cannot read is the most loyal ally a man can keep. The colour drained from Charles's face until he seemed almost ghostly, gripping the mantle to steady himself. His eyes darted to Theodore, then back to me, wide with disbelief, with horror. You can read," he whispered at last, the words catching like a ragged breath. It was not a question, but the cracking of a man's delusion, the collapse of a fortress built on lies. I closed the diary slowly, the sound of the pages pressing shut like a door sealing behind us. I raised my eyes to his, no longer lowered in feigned submission, no longer dulled by the mask I had worn for so long. I held his gaze with the strength that had been tempered over a decade of silence, a strength he had never once thought to imagine. And then I spoke, my voice clear, unshaken, each word falling heavy in the still air. "I have known everything. For 10 years. The fire hissed softly, a log collapsing into embers, as if the house itself exhaled in witness. Charles staggered back, his mouth opening and closing, but no denial came. The room was no longer his. The truth had been read aloud, not in secret pages, but in the voice of the wife he had dismissed, underestimated, and betrayed. The silence that followed my words lingered in the parlour long after Theodore had gathered his papers, and Charles had collapsed into his chair, pale and trembling. The weight of truth had finally cracked the polished surface of his life, and once it spilled into the open, there was no gathering it back. Within weeks, what began as whispers in town grew into formal proceedings. The courthouse bell in the centre of Vermont tolled over hearings where his name, once spoken with respect, became a curse. Charges were laid with the certainty of stone: usury, tax fraud, smuggling. Men he had once considered allies turned away, their testimonies unwilling but unavoidable under oath. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with weathered hands, arrived one morning at our door with 2 deputies, their boots leaving heavy prints in the frost. Charles, in his fine suit, tried to protest, his voice rising in a frenzy, but the sight of iron cuffs closing around his wrists silenced him in a way I had never seen. As they led him out, the town gathered in silence along the street, their faces a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. He passed them with eyes darting for sympathy, but found none. The trial was swift by the standards of the time. Theodore, though careful to remain impartial, oversaw parts of the investigation from Boston and made certain the evidence was handled with precision. I sat in the gallery once, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening as Charles's own handwriting was read aloud, his ledger of sins exposed line by line. There was no disguising it, no charming his way free. The man who had mocked me for ignorance was undone by the arrogance of believing I had none. When the sentence was handed down, I felt no triumph, only release. The ties that bound me to him, legal, financial, emotional, were cut clean. The divorce came quickly after, the judge awarding me the house and a portion of assets proven free from corruption. For the first time in my life, the roof over my head was mine, not because it had been given, but because it had been defended. The rooms that had once echoed with Charles's footsteps now filled with quieter sounds. The sweep of chalk on slate, the murmur of women's voices stumbling over syllables, the rise of laughter when a word finally fit together like a solved puzzle. I cleared the parlour, set a long wooden table at the centre, and called it a school. New Dawn School, a name whispered to me in the stillness of one morning when sunlight poured through the lace curtains as though blessing the start of something new. At first, there were only 3 women. A neighbour's wife with hands rough from farm work, her cheeks burning with shame as she confessed she could not sign her own name. A grandmother who had raised 6 children but never read a bedtime story aloud. And a young mother with eyes shadowed by exhaustion, determined that her daughters would never know the same silence she carried. They arrived in coats, patched at the elbows, clutching pencils like unfamiliar tools. I greeted each one with warmth, setting their fear aside with simple words. Here, no one is foolish. Here, every step forward is victory. We began with letters traced in chalk. Words sounded out like hymns. Their voices quivered at first, then steadied. I saw in their eyes the same hunger I had once felt crouched beneath the maple tree with Mrs. Davenport's guidance. And in guiding them, I felt something open in me, a sense of purpose that stretched beyond survival into the realm of giving. Word spread quietly at first, then faster. Within a year, the parlour table was too small. I borrowed benches from the church, set up lamps in the evenings, and the house rang with recitations and laughter. Reporters from the county paper came one spring, their notebooks scratching as they asked how a widow had turned her husband's house into a beacon for the town. The article called me "The Woman Who Built Doors Where Walls Once Stood." Soon, more women came from neighbouring villages, some walking miles with their children in tow, just to sit at the table and trace their names. The school became more than lessons. It became a gathering place, a refuge, a quiet revolution stitched together by women who had been told they were less. We shared food, advice, stories, and in those evenings I saw the strength of community bloom like wildflowers in a field long thought barren. Years passed, and the parlour school grew into something larger. With donations gathered and support from townsfolk who had once looked at me with pity, we moved into a small brick building by the square. There, under a hand-painted sign that still read New Dawn School, generations of women, and men too eventually, learned not just to read, but to claim their voice. In time, I wrote a book, setting down the methods I had pieced together from scraps and instinct, from memory and practice. It was not lofty, just practical. How to teach when students were frightened, how to use the rhythm of familiar songs to anchor syllables, how to remind grown women that dignity is never too late to reclaim. The book travelled farther than I ever thought possible, and so did I. Invitations came to speak at libraries, churches, even universities. I stood at podiums with my glasses perched on my nose, telling my story not as tragedy, but as testimony. Each time I spoke, I carried the same diary with me, the red leather, worn now, the gold letters faded. Not as a symbol of pain, but as proof that what was once meant to shackle me had instead set me free. I would hold it up before audiences and say, "This was once my prison. Now it is my key." And the applause that followed was not for vengeance, but for the resilience of turning darkness into light. Now, in these later years, as I sit by the window, and watch the sun settle over the New England hills, I think of all the paths that led me here, the faces of the women who first stumbled through their alphabets, the children who grew into readers because their mothers had found courage to learn, the strangers who shook my hand after a lecture and whispered, "Thank you." All of it, every triumph and every step, rose from the ashes of a marriage built on deception. So when I look back at that red diary, I do not see only betrayal. I see the beginning of my rebirth. Once, it was the tool of a man who thought ignorance was my fate. Now, it is the emblem of everything I became when I refused to accept that fate. And if you take nothing else from my story, let it be this: knowledge is a weapon. Do not ever allow another soul to define you by what they believe you lack. For 10 long years, I pretended I couldn't read, all so that my husband would never suspect what I knew. Every Thursday night, he locked himself in his study with a red leather diary, believing his secrets were safe, because his wife was too simple to understand cursive. He never imagined those very pages would one day be read aloud by me. If stories like this speak to you, I'd be honored if you subscribed or left a thought in the comments. It helps me keep sharing these voices of truth and resilience. So tell me, how would you feel if the person you trusted most wrote you off as a fool? Wishing you peace and a gentle evening wherever you're listening from.